I was driving down the highway, the steady hum of my old truck, the only sound in the quiet afternoon when my phone suddenly rang. The caller ID flashed the number of the Central Police Precinct. My heart skipped a beat, but nothing could have prepared me for the sound of my son, Christopher, weeping on the other end of the line. "Dad, please help me." He choked out his voice, trembling so hard I could barely understand him. My father-in-law just had me arrested. My blood turned to absolute ice. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching against the asphalt, as I made a violent turn right in the middle of the road. I did not ask questions. I did not hesitate. I disconnected the call with my son and immediately dialed the only person who needed to know what was happening. "Jonathan," I growled through the Bluetooth speaker, my voice shaking with a rage I had not felt in decades. "Prepare a full hostile takeover protocol for Pierce Logistics. I want absolute control over their corporate debt by the end of the day." If you are listening to this story, take a deep breath, because the way I tore off the masks of the monsters who tried to put my son behind bars will teach you a very expensive lesson. Never judge an old man by the cheap clothes he wears. My name is Harrison Cole. I am 77 years old, and for the past 5 years, I have lived the quiet, unassuming life of a retired mechanic. When my beautiful wife passed away, I realized that all the money in the world could not buy back the time we had lost. So I stepped down as the anonymous founder of my private equity firm, Vanguard Apex, transferred my $850 million into blind trusts, and simply vanished from the shadows of the corporate world. I traded my tailored suits for faded flannel shirts, and I moved into a modest house in the suburbs. I did not keep my wealth a secret out of paranoia. I kept it a secret because of Christopher. He was 29 at the time, bright, ambitious, and determined to build his own legacy. I had seen too many children of billionaires turn into entitled, lazy shadows of their parents. I wanted my son to know the value of hard work, to earn his own victories, and to never feel eclipsed by my shadow. So I let him believe his old man was just a humble pensioner living on Social Security. It was the hardest secret I ever kept, but it worked. Christopher worked his way up from the bottom, eventually landing a respectable management position at Pierce Logistics. He fell deeply in love with the corporate executive daughter, Valerie Pierce, and married her. I thought my son had found his happily ever after. I thought he was safe. I was a fool. As I pushed my rusty Ford to 80 miles an hour, weaving recklessly through the afternoon traffic, my phone beeped. Jonathan Reed, my wealth manager, and the only man who knew the true extent of my fortune, was back on the line. Sir Jonathan said, his usually calm voice laced with urgency. "I have prepared the takeover documents for Pierce Logistics. But you need to know Gregory Pierce is the one who filed the criminal charges against Christopher. He is claiming your son embezzled $4 million from the company accounts to pay off illegal gambling debts." "Gambling debts," I practically shouted, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned completely white. "Christopher does not even play the lottery. He is the most disciplined man I know." "This is a setup, Jonathan. A blatant, disgusting setup." "I know," Sir Jonathan replied smoothly. "I am already digging into their shadow ledgers. Pierce Logistics has been bleeding cash for over 8 months. They are drowning in offshore margin calls. Gregory Pierce is desperate, and desperate men do terrible things." "Find the money," I demanded, weaving past a slow-moving truck and ignoring the furious honk of its horn. "Find exactly where that $4 million went. Gregory thinks he can use my son as a convenient scapegoat. He thinks Christopher is just a middle-class nobody with a poor, helpless father who cannot afford a decent lawyer. I am going to bury him. I am going to buy his entire miserable company and dismantle it piece by piece while he watches." "Give me 2 hours, Mr. Cole," Jonathan promised. "I will have every financial skeleton Gregory has ever buried. Do whatever it takes," I said. "Just make sure that when I pull the trigger, that arrogant bastard loses absolutely everything." I disconnected the call, and stared at the road ahead, the adrenaline pumping furiously through my veins. My mind raced back to the last time I saw Christopher and his wife. It was just 2 weeks ago at a Sunday barbecue. Valerie had spent the entire afternoon complaining about how small their house was, casually dropping hints about her massive family estate. Gregory Pierce had attended as well, looking down his nose at my cheap lawn chairs and the store-bought potato salad. He had offered me a pitying smile, the kind of smile a king gives to a peasant, and told me I should be grateful his daughter was lowering her standards to marry into my family. I had swallowed my pride that day. I had bitten my tongue and smiled back, all for the sheer sake of his happiness. I had allowed those greedy, pretentious snakes to treat me like dirt because I believed they truly loved Christopher. The realization that they were plotting to destroy his life, to throw him into a federal prison to save their own skin, made my chest physically ache with rage. The precinct came into view, a bleak concrete building surrounded by flashing police cruisers. I slammed my car into a parking spot, not even caring that the tires hopped over the curb. I killed the engine and sat in the silence of the cabin for exactly 10 seconds. I closed my eyes and took a deep, steadying breath. I needed to be smart. If I walked in there throwing my weight around and screaming about my wealth, Gregory would immediately know he was in danger. He would panic, destroy evidence, and flee. I could not let that happen. I had to play the part he expected me to play. I had to be the broken, terrified father begging for mercy. I opened the car door and stepped into the hot afternoon air. My worn boots struck the pavement heavily as I walked toward the main entrance of the police station. Inside those walls, my only son was sitting in a cold cell, completely terrified and confused, surrounded by the exact people who had orchestrated his downfall. I reached out and grasped the metal handle of the door. The reflection staring back at me in the glass was that of a frail, grieving, and entirely helpless old man. But beneath that carefully constructed disguise, a ruthless predator had just been awakened. They wanted a victim. I would give them a war. I slowly pulled the heavy glass door open and stepped into the freezing, fluorescent-lit reception area of the police precinct. The stagnant air smelled of stale coffee, floor wax, and sheer human misery. Telephones rang constantly in the background, blending with the muted chatter of police officers and the distant slam of holding cell doors. I kept my head slightly bowed, rounding my shoulders to shrink my posture. To anyone looking, I was just a tired old man who had spent his life working under the hood of a car, summoned to face a nightmare he could not afford to fight. My eyes scanned the bleak room until they landed on the two people waiting near the front desk. Gregory Pierce stood tall and immaculate, wearing a dark navy bespoke suit. Not a single gray hair was out of place. He exuded untouchable arrogance, checking his phone with mild inconvenience. Standing right next to him was his daughter, my daughter-in-law Valerie. She held a crumpled tissue to her face, shaking softly as she sobbed. I shuffled toward them, making sure my steps looked hesitant and unsure. Gregory looked up from his screen. His eyes swept over my faded flannel shirt, my grease-stained denim jeans, and the scuffed leather of my work boots. The corner of his mouth twitched upward in a microscopic smirk before he quickly rearranged his features into a mask of solemn pity. Harrison Gregory said, his voice smooth and dripping with condescension. I am so sorry to drag you down here. I truly am. But the situation left me with absolutely no other choice. What happened? I asked, letting my voice tremble just enough to sound completely broken. On the phone, Christopher was crying. He said he was arrested. Gregory, please tell me that there is some kind of misunderstanding. Valerie let out a loud theatrical sob. She rushed forward and grabbed my rough hands. Dad, it is awful, she cried, looking up at me with wide, tear-filled eyes. I did not want to believe it either. But Christopher has been hiding a terrible secret from all of us. He has a massive gambling addiction. Underground poker, sports betting, things I do not even understand. She squeezed my hands tightly, playing the devastated wife flawlessly. He has been so aggressive lately, Dad. So secretive and distant. Last week, he completely drained our joint savings account. And when my father ran an internal audit at the logistics company this morning, they found the missing money. Gregory stepped closer, placing a heavy paternal hand on his daughter's shoulder. Your son embezzled $4 million from my corporate accounts, Harrison, he stated flatly. $4 million. I had to call the authorities to protect my company and my daughter. 4 million, I repeated, forcing my eyes to widen in shock. I let my jaw drop, staring at the floor as if the sheer weight of that number had physically crushed me. Gregory, please. Christopher is a good boy. He has never gambled a day in his life. There must be an error with the banks. There is absolutely no error here, Harrison Gregory replied coldly. We already have the entire digital footprint. The money moved from his secure terminal directly to offshore accounts. The police have already confiscated his laptop. He is facing federal wire fraud charges and grand theft. He will be looking at 20 years in a federal penitentiary. I covered my face with my rough hands. Behind the darkness of my fingers, my mind raced with razor-sharp clarity. $4 million. Pierce Logistics was a sinking ship. My wealth manager had confirmed they were drowning in margin calls. Gregory did not have $4 million sitting around to be stolen. He took it. He drained his own corporate accounts to pay off his illegal offshore debts and needed a sacrificial lamb to feed to the IRS when they audited him on Monday. My unsuspecting son was the perfect target. I let out a ragged sigh, removing my hands from my face. I looked at Gregory with pleading, defeated eyes. Gregory, please, I begged, letting my voice crack with manufactured shame. He is my only son. There has to be something we can do. I have a small pension. I have my house. I can sign it over to you. I will do whatever it takes now. Just do not let them send my boy to prison. Gregory sighed a deep, performative sigh. He adjusted his silk tie and looked down at me with absolute contempt. Harrison, the wheels of justice are already turning, he said softly. I cannot simply uncall the police. But because he is family, I convinced the magistrate to set bail. It is $500,000, meaning you need $50,000 in cash to get him out tonight through a bondsman. I assume that amount is completely out of your reach. I nodded rapidly, acting frantic. $50,000, I can get it. I have some emergency retirement bonds I can cash out with a heavy penalty. I will call the bank manager right now. I promise I will get the money. Please just let me take him home tonight. Gregory shared a brief, unreadable look with Valerie. Very well, he said. You get the bail money. Take him home. But understand this, Harrison. I expect full restitution. We will discuss how you are going to repay me the remaining $4 million next week. I thanked him profusely, bowing my head like a beaten dog. I walked over to the bail bondsman window and made a quick phone call. Within 20 minutes, the required $50,000 was wired from an anonymous shell account I maintained for absolute emergencies. The heavy steel door at the back of the room buzzed open. A stern police officer led Christopher out into the bleak waiting area. My heart ached when I saw my boy treated like a common criminal. His wrists were shackled tightly in heavy iron cuffs. His usually immaculate hair was disheveled and matted with cold sweat. His skin was terrifyingly pale. He was stumbling over his own feet, entirely unable to walk in a straight line. His eyes were glassy, vacant, and unfocused, as if he were staring blankly through the solid concrete walls rather than seeing anything in the room. Dad. Christopher mumbled, his voice slurred and heavy. Dad, I feel so tired. My head is spinning. I rushed forward and wrapped my arms around his trembling shoulders. I have got you, son, I whispered, supporting his dead weight against my side. You are safe now. Let us go home. I guided him slowly toward the glass exit doors, his feet dragging across the linoleum floor. Right before we stepped out into the humid evening air, I paused and cast one final subtle glance over my shoulder. Gregory and Valerie were standing casually near the front desk, silently watching us leave the station. They genuinely thought I was not looking, assuming I was nothing more than a pathetic, broken old man carrying his completely ruined son away in absolute disgrace. But I clearly saw it. Valerie slowly lowered her crumpled tissue, wiped away her fake tears, and a deeply cruel, triumphant smirk spread entirely across her flawless face. Gregory met her cold eyes and nodded slowly, a dark, calculating smile of absolute victory physically twisting his lips. They honestly believed they had finally won. They believed their monstrous lie was perfectly secure. They had absolutely no idea that they had just unknowingly declared a massive, unwinnable war on a quiet, ruthless man who completely owned the very ground they walked on every single day. The heavy metal doors of the precinct clanged shut behind us, cutting off the sterile glare of the fluorescent lights. I practically had to carry Christopher across the dark asphalt of the parking lot. He was 34 years old, a man in the prime of his life, but right now he felt as fragile as a hollowed-out shell. His knees buckled with every other step, and his breathing was shallow, ragged, and entirely out of rhythm. I managed to get him into the passenger seat of my rusty Ford, buckling his seatbelt for him because his hands were shaking too violently to grasp the buckle. He slumped against the window, his forehead leaving a streak of cold sweat against the glass. I walked around to the driver's side, climbed in, and started the engine. The heater roared to life, but Christopher shivered uncontrollably. I pulled out of the parking lot, the glaring streetlights washing over his pale face in rhythmic intervals. I needed answers. I needed to understand how my hard-working, deeply disciplined son had ended up in a holding cell, accused of a multi-million-dollar federal crime. "Christopher," said softly, keeping my eyes glued to the dark road ahead. "Talk to me, son." "What happened back there?" Gregory said. "You stole $4 million. He said you lost it all gambling. Tell me the truth so I can help you fix this." Christopher did not answer immediately. His head lolled to the side and he blinked slowly, struggling to keep his eyes open. His pupils were dilated to the point where the vibrant green of his irises was almost entirely swallowed by black. "Dad," he mumbled, his voice sounding thick and coated like his tongue was too large for his mouth. "I am just so tired. My brain is buzzing. I cannot remember the codes. Valerie asked me for the codes, but the numbers keep moving around in my head." I frowned, glancing at him at the next red light. "What codes?" "Christopher, the bank codes, the corporate access passwords." He swallowed hard, a thin line of saliva gathering at the corner of his mouth. He raised a trembling hand to wipe it away, but missed his mouth entirely, his coordination completely ruined. "The lights," he whispered nonsensically. "The lights in the office were too bright. Gregory gave me a coffee, but it tasted like metal. Everything tastes like metal now. I did not take the money, Dad. I do not even know how to play cards. I just want to sleep. Please let me sleep." I pressed my foot down on the gas pedal, my knuckles turning white against the steering wheel. A man who has just been caught embezzling $4 million acts a specific way. I had seen corporate thieves in my past life running Vanguard Apex. I knew exactly what a panicked, cornered, white-collar criminal looked like. They sweat, they lie, they hyperventilate, and they frantically try to justify their actions. They beg for lawyers and weave complex webs of deceit to protect themselves. Christopher was not acting like a panicked thief. He was acting like a patient waking up from heavy surgical anesthesia. My mind, honed by decades of ruthless corporate acquisitions and high-stakes financial warfare, began to process the glaring inconsistencies of the night. I mentally rewound the tape, visualizing every single detail of the interaction inside the police precinct. I thought about Valerie. She had stood there weeping, playing the part of the utterly devastated and financially ruined wife. She claimed that Christopher had been aggressively draining their joint savings accounts, leaving them completely destitute and terrified for their future. But my memory latched onto a specific visual detail. When she had reached out to grab my hands in a fake display of daughterly affection, her sleeve had pulled back. Resting elegantly on her wrist was a brand-new custom-crafted Patek Philippe watch. The bezel was heavily encrusted with flawless factory-set diamonds. It was a rare boutique piece, one that I recognized immediately, because I had once bought a similar model for my late wife. That watch retailed for a minimum of $150,000, and it had not been on Valerie's wrist during our barbecue 2 weeks ago. A woman who just discovered her husband bankrupted them does not casually wear a brand new $150,000 diamond timepiece to a police station. Then I turned my analytical focus toward Gregory Pierce. He had looked me directly in the eyes and confidently stated that my son had stolen $4 million in cash liquidity from his corporate accounts. It was a bold, devastating accusation perfectly designed to humiliate a poor working-class father. But Gregory made one fatal miscalculation. He had absolutely no idea who he was actually talking to. I was the hidden, silent majority shareholder of the hedge fund that owned the holding company actively monitoring Pierce Logistics. I had instructed Jonathan Reed to review their ledgers just hours ago. But even before that, I already knew the grim reality of Gregory's business. Pierce Logistics was a failing enterprise. They had been aggressively bleeding capital for the past 8 months due to catastrophic mismanagement and supply chain failures. Gregory was drowning in illegal offshore margin calls and desperate backdoor loans just to keep the lights on in his corporate headquarters. The mathematical reality was stark and undeniable. You cannot steal $4 million in cash liquidity from a company that does not possess $4 million in cash liquidity. Pierce Logistics simply did not have those funds sitting in a secure terminal, waiting to be wired away. The money never existed in their operational budget, unless, of course, the money was a phantom transfer. Gregory had likely siphoned whatever remaining credit lines he had left, moved the funds to his own offshore debt collectors, and then fabricated the digital footprint to point directly toward a convenient scapegoat. The impending IRS audit scheduled for Monday meant Gregory needed a sacrificial lamb immediately. He needed someone with high-level system access to take the catastrophic fall for his own massive embezzlement scheme. He chose my son. I looked over at Christopher again, my heart pounding, with a dark, terrifying realization. He had not gambled. He had not stolen anything. Gregory and Valerie had set him up, and to ensure he could not defend himself, they had done something unspeakably evil. Suddenly, a horrible, wet, choking sound erupted from the passenger seat. Christopher violently lurched forward against his seatbelt. His entire body went completely rigid, his spine arching backward as a brutal seizure took hold of his muscles. His arms flailed wildly, striking the dashboard and the window with terrifying force. A thick white foam began to spill rapidly from the corners of his mouth, trailing down his chin and soaking into his wrinkled collar. His eyes rolled back so far into his skull that only the bloodshot whites remained visible in the dim streetlights. I slammed the brakes, throwing the heavy truck onto the empty shoulder. I realized then that my only son had been deliberately, ruthlessly drugged. I threw the truck into park and unbuckled my seatbelt in one violent motion. Christopher was thrashing against the passenger door. His jaw clamped shut as foam bubbled past his lips. I grabbed his shoulders, holding him steady to prevent his head from striking the hard dashboard. "Hold on, son," I pleaded, my voice breaking, as I watched his eyes roll wildly. "Just hold on for me." The seizure lasted for what felt like an absolute eternity. Every agonizing second stretched out as I counted his ragged, gasping breaths. Finally, his muscles went completely limp. He slumped forward unconscious, his chest rising and falling in shallow, desperate rhythms. I grabbed a rag from the glove compartment, wiped the foam from his chin, and quickly secured his seatbelt again. I did not call an ambulance. If I called emergency services, there would be a public record. The police would be notified, and Gregory would immediately know exactly where we were. He would send his corporate lawyers to intercept the medical reports, burying the truth before I could even see it. I threw the truck back into gear and slammed my foot onto the gas pedal. I drove directly past the turnoff for my quiet suburban neighborhood. I merged onto the interstate, pushing the heavy, rusting vehicle well past the speed limit. I was not taking my son to a public hospital where he would just be another number waiting in a crowded emergency room. I was taking him to the only place I completely trusted. I refused to let my son become a tragic headline manipulated by a corrupt executive trying to cover his massive financial crimes. He had already weaponized the justice system against Christopher tonight, and I would absolutely not give him a second chance. 5 years ago, when I sold my equity firm, I secretly purchased a controlling stake in a discreet, high-end private clinic located on the outskirts of the city. It was a sanctuary for politicians, elite business moguls, and high-profile public figures who required absolute anonymity. The medical staff there did not answer to the Public Board of Health. They answered exclusively to me. I pulled up to the gated rear entrance of the clinic, a secluded alleyway entirely hidden by tall, manicured hedges. I laid on the horn until the heavy steel security gates slowly parted. A security guard stepped out, raising his hand to order me away. I did not stop. I drove the truck right up to the private loading dock, killed the engine, and leaped out into the cool night air. I opened the passenger door, hauled Christopher out, and hoisted his dead weight over my shoulder. The security guard rushed forward, reaching out to grab my arm. "You cannot park here," the guard ordered sharply. "This is a restricted medical facility. You need to leave right now, or I am calling the police." I ignored him entirely, dragging Christopher toward the sliding glass doors. I slowly raised my head and locked eyes with him. "I am Harrison Cole," I said, my voice dropping into a low, deadly register. "You have exactly 10 seconds to open those doors and call Dr. Richard Evans, the Chief of Medicine, before I personally terminate your employment and ensure you never work in private security again." The guard froze. He had likely never seen me, but the absolute authority in my tone made him hesitate. He keyed his radio, whispering frantically. Less than a minute later, the glass doors slid open, and a team of nurses rushed out with a medical gurney. Right behind them was Dr. Evans. He took one look at my face and turned completely pale. "Mr. Cole," Dr. Evans gasped quickly, stepping aside to let the nurses load Christopher onto the gurney. "We had no idea you were coming." I strode past him, following the gurney down the pristine, marble-lined hallway. "I do not have time for pleasantries, doctor," I said sharply. "This is my son. He just suffered a massive violent seizure. He has severe motor function loss, dilated pupils, and total cognitive dissonance. Someone has systematically poisoned him, and I need to know exactly what is in his bloodstream right now." The doctor immediately shifted into professional mode, barking orders at the medical staff as we rushed into a private intensive care suite. The room was equipped with advanced diagnostic machinery. They moved Christopher onto the bed, instantly connecting him to heart monitors and intravenous lines. I pulled Dr. Evans into the corridor. "Listen to me very carefully," I whispered, staring directly into his frightened eyes. "There will be absolutely no digital record of my son entering this building. You will assign your most trusted technicians to run a full expedited toxicology screen. You will test for every known narcotic, neurotoxin, and synthetic chemical compound on the planet. And you will force every single person in that room to sign a binding non-disclosure agreement before they are allowed to leave this hallway. Understand, I will run the samples myself. We will have preliminary results for you in less than an hour." I watched him sprint toward the laboratory. I walked back into the intensive care suite and stood silently at the foot of the bed. Christopher looked so small lying there, his chest rising and falling beneath the crisp white hospital sheets. The steady, rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor was the only sound left in the massive, sterile space. My son was finally safe, protected by a fortress of wealth and power that his enemies did not even know existed. But my work for the night was not finished. Gregory and Valerie were likely sitting in their lavish living room, waiting for me to call them in a blind panic. They expected me to beg for their help, to lean on them for support, while my son deteriorated. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket. I selected Valerie's contact. I needed to feed them a plausible lie. I typed the message carefully. Chris is having a severe mental breakdown, I wrote. He is completely hysterical and refusing to go home. I have checked him into a cheap roadside motel to try and cool him off. I will stay here tonight and call you tomorrow. I am so sorry for all of this trouble, Valerie. I hit send. They thought they had won. They thought they had outsmarted a foolish, trusting old man. I slid the phone away and turned toward the door. The minutes dragged by with agonizing slowness. I paced the suite, running through every possible scenario. I needed undeniable proof. I needed the chemical signature of their crime. That meant she had carefully utilized something far more sophisticated, a highly synthesized compound designed specifically to avoid standard detection and mimic a natural psychological collapse. She wanted him to look guilty, unhinged, and completely unreliable. The silence in the room was suffocating, heavy with the unknown. Finally, the door handle clicked. Dr. Evans stepped slowly back into the room. His face was drained of color, his skin holding a sickly grayish hue. His hands were trembling slightly as he clutched a stark red medical folder tightly against his chest. He looked at Christopher, then slowly raised his eyes to meet mine. The silence in the intensive care suite stretched out heavy and suffocating, broken only by the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor. Dr. Evans did not speak immediately. He clutched the stark red medical folder against his chest, as if the contents inside were physically burning him. I took a step forward, my heavy work boots squeaking slightly against the polished marble floor. "I told you to run a full toxicology screen," I said, keeping my voice low and dangerously calm. "Tell me exactly what you found in my son." Dr. Evans swallowed hard, his throat dry. He opened the red folder and pulled out a stack of dense, computerized printouts. "Mr. Cole," he began, his voice trembling slightly, "Christopher has not been consuming recreational narcotics. There is no trace of cocaine, amphetamines, or alcohol in his system. What we found is something entirely different, something highly sophisticated and incredibly malicious." He handed me the first page of the report. I stared at the complex chemical breakdowns, the highlighted spikes in the graphs. "I am not a doctor," I said coldly. "Explain this to me in plain English." The doctor took a deep breath, pointing a shaking finger at a specific cluster of data on the page. "Your son has an alarming concentration of a highly synthesized neurotoxin in his bloodstream," he explained. "It is a complex derivative of scopolamine, engineered and mixed with heavy metals to delay the onset of symptoms and avoid detection in standard medical exams. This is not something a person accidentally ingests, Mr. Cole. This compound is meticulously designed to bypass the blood-brain barrier over an extended period of time." I stared at him, the cold reality of his words beginning to freeze the blood in my veins. "What exactly does this toxin do to a person?" "Doctor, it systematically dismantles the central nervous system," Dr. Evans replied, his voice dropping to a somber whisper. "Initially, it mimics the symptoms of severe exhaustion and chronic stress. But as the compound builds up in the fatty tissues of the brain, it induces aggressive cognitive decline. It effectively simulates early-onset dementia. The victim loses their short-term memory, their spatial awareness, and their ability to process complex information. But the most terrifying aspect of this specific compound is its effect on the prefrontal cortex. It entirely strips away a person's free will. It induces a state of extreme, almost hypnotic suggestibility. The victim remains conscious, capable of following basic instructions, but they have absolutely no ability to resist a direct command. They become a blank slate, entirely subservient to whoever is guiding them." The folder felt heavy in my hands, weighing me down with the horrifying gravity of the truth. My brilliant, hard-working son had not lost his mind. He had not gambled away millions of dollars. He had been systematically and ruthlessly poisoned. My mind immediately flashed back over the past 6 months, rapidly piecing together the subtle, sinister changes in his household. I remembered how Valerie had suddenly developed a passionate interest in culinary arts. She had insisted on preparing all of his meals from scratch. She packed his lunches every single day, brewing his morning coffee and fixing his herbal tea every night before bed. She played the role of the devoted, loving wife so perfectly. I recalled how Christopher had started losing weight, how his vibrant energy had slowly drained away, replaced by a constant, lingering lethargy. Whenever I asked him if he was feeling well, Valerie was always right there, hovering over his shoulder. She would quickly answer for him, rubbing his back and claiming he was just working too many late hours at the logistics firm. She had isolated him in plain sight. She had built an invisible cage around his mind, feeding him poison, drop by drop, meal by meal, day after day. The sheer mechanics of their devious plot unfolded in my mind with terrifying clarity. Gregory needed a scapegoat for his massive financial crimes. He needed someone with high-level executive access to the corporate mainframes to initiate those fraudulent wire transfers. But Christopher was notoriously meticulous with his security protocols. He never shared his passwords, and his terminal required biometric verification. Gregory could not simply hack the system. He needed Christopher to willingly unlock the doors. Valerie was the key. She had spent the last half-year turning her own husband into a mindless, compliant puppet. While Christopher was trapped in a chemically induced fog, sitting helplessly in his own living room, she would simply place his heavy, unresisting fingers onto the biometric scanners of his laptop. She would hold his drugged, vacant face up to the camera for retinal verification. She commanded him to recite his secure passwords, and his poisoned brain, stripped of all free will, had simply obeyed. They had literally stolen his identity right out from under him, using his own hands to authorize the transfer of $4 million to their offshore accounts. I looked down at Christopher, who was resting peacefully in the hospital bed, completely unaware of the monstrous betrayal he had endured. His own wife, the woman he had sworn to love and protect, had watched him deteriorate every single day. She had smiled at him across the breakfast table while handing him a cup of poison. She had held his hand in public while meticulously plotting to send him to a federal prison for decades. The depth of their depravity was staggering. It was not just a crime of greed. It was a profound, deeply personal violation of a human soul. A dark, quiet fury settled over my heart, solidifying into an unbreakable vow of absolute destruction. I turned back to Dr. Evans. He was watching me with wide, terrified eyes, clearly sensing the violent shift in my demeanor. I need a certified, heavily documented report of every single finding in this room. I commanded, my voice devoid of any warmth. I want blood work, brain scans, and your personal medical affidavit confirming the prolonged exposure to this synthetic neurotoxin. You will seal the original copies in your private vault, and you will hand me the digital files on a secure drive before I leave this clinic. Yes, Mr. Cole. The doctor agreed instantly, nodding his head. I will personally supervise the documentation. No one else will touch these sensitive files. I stood alone in the quiet suite as the doctor rushed back to his laboratory. I walked to the edge of the bed and gently placed my hand on the forehead of my sleeping child. His skin was finally cool to the touch. The frantic twitching in his muscles had entirely subsided under the steady drip of the medical sedatives. You are safe now, my boy, I whispered into the quiet room. I promise you they will never touch you again. The people who did this to you are going to beg for a mercy they will never receive. My phone buzzed. It was Jonathan Reed. Sir, I hacked into Pierce Logistics' shadow ledgers like you asked. It is worse than we thought. I held the phone tightly against my ear, processing the incredibly chilling words my wealth manager had just spoken. I told Jonathan to send me a secure location and bring the extracted data from their secure servers. I walked to the hospital bed, one last time brushing a lock of hair from my son's face. I promised him I would definitely return before he woke up again. I walked out of the intensive care suite, the heavy doors clicking shut behind me. Stepping into the hidden alleyway, I climbed into my truck, started the engine, and drove into the dark city streets. Jonathan's message soon arrived with an address for an abandoned underground parking structure in the financial district. It was a dark, quiet place where conversations could never be recorded. I navigated the empty roads with a singular focus. The street lamps blurred past my windshield as I pressed the accelerator to the floorboard. My mind was a storm of righteous fury and cold logic. Reaching the coordinates, I descended the spiraling concrete ramp into the subterranean darkness. The damp air smelled heavily of motor oil and decaying concrete. Flickering fluorescent tubes cast long shadows across the empty parking bays. Near the back of the lowest level, a sleek black sedan was parked with its headlights off. I pulled my Ford up next to it, killed the engine, and stepped out. Jonathan emerged slowly from the shadows of his vehicle. He was dressed in a sharp charcoal suit, a stark contrast to the grim surroundings, and he held a sleek silver laptop tucked firmly under his right arm. He did not offer me a polite greeting. He knew exactly what kind of mood I was in. He walked straight over to my truck, placed the laptop onto the scratched hood of the Ford, and flipped the screen open. The pale blue light illuminated his serious features. "Look at this, Mr. Cole," Jonathan said, his voice echoing slightly in the cavernous space. He tapped a few keys, slowly bringing up a complex web of financial spreadsheets, offshore routing numbers, and encrypted communication logs. Pierce Logistics has been a dead company walking for the better part of a year. Gregory Pierce made a series of truly catastrophic bets on international shipping futures using highly leveraged corporate funds. When the market corrected itself 8 months ago, his creditors initiated massive margin calls. To keep the company afloat, Gregory started taking out illegal loans from dangerous underground syndicates. I stared at the cascading columns of red numbers on the screen. "And the $4 million he accused my son of stealing?" I asked, my voice dangerously soft. Jonathan shook his head slowly. "It was never stolen by Christopher," he explained, pulling up a secondary document. "Gregory and Valerie executed a highly coordinated wire transfer 3 days ago. They drained the last drops of cash liquidity from operational accounts and funneled the money through shell companies in the Cayman Islands. They used those specific funds to pay off the syndicates and cover their tracks. But here's the terrifying part. The Internal Revenue Service caught wind of the financial discrepancies. They have been building a federal case for months. The IRS is scheduled to raid the headquarters on Monday morning at dawn. The pieces of their monstrous puzzle finally clicked together in my mind with devastating clarity. They knew the federal agents were coming. They knew that a full forensic audit would immediately expose their massive embezzlement and send them both to federal prison for decades. They needed a firewall. They needed a convenient, highly believable fall guy to take the entire blame before the agents kicked down their doors on Monday. "That is why they had him arrested today," I whispered, staring blindly at the glowing screen. That is why Valerie spent the last 6 months systematically poisoning my son with a synthetic neurotoxin. They needed to destroy his cognitive function so he could not defend himself during a federal interrogation. They needed him pliant, confused, and utterly incapable of explaining how his own secure terminal was used to authorize the illegal wire transfers. They set him up to look exactly like a desperate, drug-addicted gambler who stole the money and lost his mind in the process. Jonathan nodded grimly, closing the current window and opening a final, heavily encrypted email chain. "Exactly, sir." They staged the arrest on a Friday evening to ensure Christopher would spend the entire weekend locked inside a holding cell, completely cut off from competent legal counsel or proper medical evaluations. By the time the federal agents raided the building on Monday, Gregory would simply hand over the fabricated evidence pointing directly at your son. Valerie would play the tragic, betrayed wife, and Christopher would be indicted before he even understood what was happening to him. A cold silence fell over the parking garage. The sheer magnitude of their betrayal was almost too massive to comprehend. A father had conspired with his daughter to destroy an innocent man, erasing my son's future just to save their lavish lifestyles. They had smiled in my face, mocked my cheap clothes, and fed my son poison while draining their company dry. I looked up from the laptop, meeting Jonathan's eyes. "Have you secured the holding company assets yet?" I asked, my voice devoid of any warmth or mercy. "Do we have absolute controlling interest over Pierce Logistics?" "We do," Jonathan confirmed without hesitation. Vanguard. Apex holds 80% of their debt and majority equity. With a single phone call, you can legally dissolve their board of directors, freeze every corporate account they possess, and lock them out of their own building. "They belong to you now, Mr. Cole." "Good," I replied softly, reaching out to close the laptop screen. "I want you to prepare all the hostile takeover documents. I want everything airtight. When I walk into his office, I want him to know that he is looking at his executioner." Jonathan placed a hand on the closed laptop, stopping me before I could step away. "There is one more thing you need to know, sir," he said, his tone growing even darker. "I intercepted a communication between Gregory and his private attorney just 10 minutes ago. It seems throwing Christopher into a federal prison was not enough for them. They are planning to strip you of your assets as well." "What are you talking about?" I asked, my heart pounding. Jonathan took a deep breath. "Gregory knows that Christopher holds the deed to the suburban house he lives in with Valerie. He also assumes you are a poor, desperate pensioner who will do anything to keep his son out of jail. Gregory has drafted a restitution agreement. He is preparing to force you to sign over the deed to the house which you secretly purchased for Christopher 5 years ago. Furthermore, he is planning to seize your retirement fund to allegedly recoup the damages Christopher caused. They want to leave your son rotting in a cell and leave you completely homeless and destitute on the cold streets. They want to strip away every single thing you both own." The gravity of Jonathan's words hung in the damp air. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. They were trying to erase my family, using my own hard-earned money to pave over our graves. I gave Jonathan a curt nod, instructing him to finalize the takeover documents for the following day. I told him to stay entirely out of sight until I gave the signal. I climbed back into my Ford and drove into the night. I returned to the private clinic to collect Christopher. The medical team had stabilized him and administered a powerful counteracting agent to temporarily neutralize the synthetic toxin. He was still groggy, his movements sluggish, and his eyes dull, but he could walk with my support. I thanked the medical staff for their discretion and guided my son out through the hidden loading dock. I drove us toward the upscale suburban neighborhood where he lived with Valerie. The entire drive, my mind meticulously rehearsed the performance I was about to deliver. I had to bury my burning rage under a thick layer of pathetic desperation. I pulled into his concrete driveway and killed the engine. The elegant brick house stood as a monument to my quiet financial support. I secretly purchased it through a blind trust, so Christopher could start his marriage without a mortgage. Now the woman living inside was using it as a trap. I helped Christopher out of the passenger seat, draping his heavy arm over my shoulder. We shuffled up the walkway to the front door. Before I could reach for the doorbell, the heavy oak door swung open. Valerie stood in the foyer wearing a silk robe and a look of profound theatrical concern. She gasped, pressing her manicured hands to her mouth. "Christopher," she cried out, rushing forward to wrap her arms around his waist. "Oh, my poor darling, what have they done to you?" She gently pulled him away from me, guiding his stumbling frame into the brightly lit hallway. I followed them inside, keeping my head bowed and my shoulders slumped. I let a tremor enter my hands as I closed the door behind us. "I am so sorry, Valerie," I whispered, forcing my voice to sound broken and humiliated. I had to drain my emergency savings just to cover the bondsman fee. The police were awful to him. He has been shivering and confused ever since I bailed him out. I do not know what to do anymore." Valerie turned to look at me, her eyes brimming with manufactured tears. "You did your best, Dad," she said, her voice dripping with sickly, sweet sympathy. "It is just a terrible tragedy." The stress of his gambling debts must have caused a complete mental break. I will take over from here. I am going to put him on the sofa and make him his favorite herbal tea to soothe his nerves. It will help him sleep through the night. Herbal tea. The very vehicle she had been using to systematically poison my son for half a year. A fresh wave of disgust washed over me, but I forced a pathetic smile onto my face. "Thank you, Valerie," I mumbled, wiping a non-existent tear from my cheek. "You are a wonderful wife to him. Could I possibly use your restroom before I head to the motel for the night?" "Of course, Dad," she replied smoothly, already guiding Christopher toward the plush sofa. "Take your time." I walked slowly down the hallway until I was out of her direct line of sight. The moment I stepped into the guest bathroom, my fragile old man persona vanished completely. I moved with swift, silent precision. I reached into the deep pocket of my flannel jacket and pulled out a high-definition microcamera. It was a piece of tactical surveillance equipment no larger than a coat button. I quietly stepped out of the bathroom and crept down the adjacent corridor that offered a blind view into the massive gourmet kitchen. Valerie was standing with her back to me, waiting for the electric kettle to boil. She had already placed a ceramic mug on the granite counter. Right above the kitchen island was an iron ventilation grate. I silently climbed onto a sturdy wooden stool, popped the corner of the grate open with my pocket knife, and affixed the magnetic camera to the inner rim. I adjusted the tiny lens until it had a perfect downward view of the kitchen counter. I hopped down and slipped the knife back into my pocket without making a single sound. The kettle clicked off, whistling softly. Valerie poured the boiling water into the mug. I watched from the shadows as she reached into the deep pocket of her silk robe. She pulled out a small, unlabeled glass vial filled with a clear liquid. My heart pounded fiercely against my ribs as she carefully unscrewed the dropper and squeezed a generous amount of the synthetic neurotoxin directly into the steaming tea. She stirred it slowly with a silver spoon, humming a cheerful, sickening tune under her breath. I retreated to the bathroom, flushed the toilet, and ran the faucet to announce my return. I walked back into the living room just as Valerie was carrying the poisoned tea on a small wooden tray. Christopher was lying on the sofa, his eyes half closed in a drugged stupor. "Here you go, sweetheart," Valerie cooed, setting the tray onto the glass coffee table. "Drink this while it is hot. It will make all the bad thoughts go away." I needed a distraction, and I needed it immediately. I purposely stumbled against the edge of a heavy floor lamp, knocking a stack of hardback books onto the hardwood floor with a loud crash. Valerie jumped, spinning around with a sharp gasp. "I am so sorry," I stammered, dropping to my knees and fumbling frantically with the fallen books. "My hands are just so shaky tonight. I am so clumsy." Valerie sighed impatiently. "It is fine, Dad," she snapped, stepping away. As she bent down, I blocked her line of sight. In one practiced motion, I reached behind my back, grabbed the poisoned mug, and seamlessly swapped it with an identical mug of harmless lukewarm water resting on the side table. I hid the poisoned tea behind a vase. I stood up. "I really should get going now," I apologized softly. I walked out the front door, slowly reaching my truck. I drove exactly 2 blocks down the street, parked in the shadows, and pulled out my tablet. The live video feed illuminated the dark cabin. The screen showed Valerie walking back into the kitchen. She picked up her cell phone and made a private call. She held the device to her ear, leaning against the marble island. I held my breath in the darkness of my truck, staring intensely at the glowing screen of my tablet. The high-definition camera I had hidden inside the kitchen vent provided a perfect, unobstructed view of the marble island and the surrounding area. Valerie stood exactly where I had left her. She picked up her cell phone from the counter, her manicured fingers tapping impatiently against the sleek casing. I watched her expression shift from the fake, sickeningly sweet mask of a concerned wife into something entirely cold and calculated. She poured the remaining hot water from the electric kettle down the stainless steel sink, humming that same cheerful tune as if she had not just attempted to permanently destroy her own husband. My hands gripped the edges of the tablet so tightly that my knuckles ached. I could see the harmless mug of lukewarm water sitting on the coffee table in the background of the shot, right where Christopher was resting. He was safe for now, but the sheer proximity of the danger made my blood run cold. Suddenly, the sharp ringing of her cell phone shattered the quiet atmosphere of the kitchen. Valerie glanced at the caller identification, a wide, genuine smile spreading across her face. She swiped the screen to answer and tapped the speakerphone icon, placing the device flat on the cool marble surface so she could wipe down the counters. The acoustics of the large, open concept kitchen amplified the audio perfectly, feeding the sound directly into the hidden microphone of my camera. I reached out and turned the volume dial on my tablet all the way to its maximum limit, refusing to miss a single syllable of their twisted conversation. Gregory Pierce's voice echoed through the small cabin of my truck, crisp and dripping with arrogant satisfaction. "Is the mechanic gone?" he asked, not even bothering to use my name. Valerie laughed, a sharp, grating sound that made my stomach turn. "Yes, Dad," she replied, leaning casually against the counter. "The old man just left. He completely bought the motel lie. He was practically crying, apologizing for being so clumsy and knocking over my books. It was honestly pathetic to watch. He actually thinks Christopher is just having a nervous breakdown over fake gambling debts." Gregory chuckled on the other end of the line, a low, rumbling sound of absolute victory. "And what about Christopher?" he inquired smoothly. "Did you administer the evening dose?" Valerie picked up a damp cloth and lazily wiped at a non-existent stain on the marble. "Just gave it to him," she confirmed. "I used a double dose this time just to be absolutely certain." The old man distracted me for a second, but I made sure Christopher got his tea right before his father walked out the door. He is drinking it right now. By tomorrow morning, his brain will be completely mush. He will not even remember his own name, let alone the passwords to the corporate mainframes. I felt a violent surge of protective fury rising in my chest. Hearing her speak so casually about melting my son's cognitive functions, treating his entire existence as a minor administrative hurdle, was beyond monstrous. She was discussing the systematic destruction of a human life with the exact same emotional weight as taking out the weekly trash. It was pure, unadulterated evil wrapped in designer clothing and a pleasant suburban facade. Gregory let out a satisfied sigh over the speakerphone. "Good work, Valerie," he praised her. "The federal agents are finalizing their warrants as we speak. Our inside contact at the Internal Revenue Service confirmed they are definitely hitting the logistics headquarters at dawn on Monday. We have a very narrow window to execute the final phase of this operation." Valerie stopped wiping the counter and leaned closer to the phone. "Is everything ready on your end?" she asked, a note of anxious excitement creeping into her voice. "Have the offshore transfers cleared the shell accounts?" "Absolutely," Gregory replied confidently. "The $4 million is completely secure and untraceable. It is sitting safely in the Geneva accounts, completely out of the jurisdiction of the federal government. All we need to do now is feed Christopher to the wolves. When the federal agents tear his office apart on Monday, they will find the fabricated digital trail leading directly to his secure terminal. They will find a deeply confused, drug-addled addict who cannot answer a single question without contradicting himself. They will drag him away in handcuffs and the embezzlement case will be closed forever." Valerie smiled, her eyes gleaming with dark greed. "And the house?" she pressed eagerly. "What about the house?" Gregory laughed again. "Do not worry about the house, my dear. As his lawful wife, you will file for immediate divorce on the grounds of his criminal behavior and financial ruin. We will seize the property, sell it for cash, and you will be on a first-class flight to Switzerland before the ink on his federal indictment even dries. Everything is going exactly according to my grand design." I sat alone in the dark, processing the sheer magnitude of their evil. They had orchestrated every single detail, turning my son into a disposable pawn to finance their luxurious escape. But then Gregory's voice cut through the silence once more, shifting to a darker, more predatory tone. "We still have one loose end to tie up before we leave," Gregory stated coldly. "The old mechanic." Valerie groaned loudly. "What else do we need from him, Dad? I has already broke from the bail money." "Not quite," Gregory countered smoothly. "I had my attorneys run a quiet background check on his assets. He has a small pension fund, maybe $300,000 sitting in a retirement account. It is not much, but we are not leaving a single dime on the table. Call him Valerie. Call the old man and invite him over to my estate tonight. Tell him we need to discuss a plea deal to keep his son out of a maximum security prison. We are going to squeeze him for every last penny he has. We will make him sign over his entire pension and whatever claim he has on that suburban house before the night is over." Valerie smiled a wicked, venomous expression. "You are brilliant, Dad," she purred. "I will call him in 10 minutes." I reached out with trembling fingers and slowly shut off the bright tablet screen, instantly plunging the small truck cabin back into total and complete darkness. My hands gripped the steering wheel, the leather groaning under the immense pressure. A dark, ruthless smile slowly formed across my tired face. They wanted to invite me into their home. They wanted to steal my retirement. They wanted to take absolutely everything from my innocent family without showing even a single shred of mercy. I started the engine, the low rumble vibrating through my chest. I would gladly accept their unexpected invitation, knowing exactly what to do. I would confidently walk right into the very center of the lion's den. And then, I would absolutely tear both of them to pieces. I sat in the cold silence of my truck, the glowing screen of my tablet, now totally black. My heart beat with a steady, rhythmic thud. I had just witnessed the absolute depth of their depravity captured perfectly through the hidden camera lens. Next move, the oppressive silence was shattered by the sharp ringing of my cell phone. The caller identification flashed brightly in the dark cabin. It was Gregory Pierce. I let it ring twice, taking a deep breath to mask the boiling rage in my chest. And then I answered, keeping my voice small and hesitant. "Hello," I said, allowing a slight tremor to seep into my words. Harrison Gregory replied, his tone dripping with a sickening manufactured sympathy. "I am so glad I reached you. Valerie told me you just left their house. She said you were incredibly distraught. I wanted to reach out because I am genuinely worried about your state of mind. I am just so confused." "Gregory," I lied, staring blankly at the steering wheel. "I do not understand how Christopher could do something like this to your company. He is a good boy." Gregory let out a heavy, performative sigh. "Addiction changes people, Harrison. It makes them unrecognizable. But because we are family, I have been talking with my private attorneys. I want to offer you a lifeline. I am willing to petition the federal prosecutor for a massively reduced sentence. I can keep your son out of a maximum security prison, but I need to show the board of directors that full financial restitution is being made immediately." "What kind of restitution?" I asked softly. "I need you to come to my estate tonight," Gregory instructed smoothly. "I have prepared a legal agreement. You will sign over the deed to Christopher's house, and you will transfer the balance of your retirement pension to my corporate holding accounts. It is a steep price, I know, but it is the only way to save your son's life." I closed my eyes, marveling at his sheer, unadulterated audacity. "I will be there in 1 hour," I promised, letting my voice crack perfectly. I disconnected the call and tossed the phone onto the passenger seat. The time for playing the helpless, impoverished pensioner was officially over. I put the truck into gear and drove away from the quiet suburban streets, merging onto the highway that led straight toward the glittering downtown skyline. I navigated the heavy evening traffic with absolute precision, pulling into the secured underground garage of a luxury high-rise building located in the very center of the financial district. This was my private sanctuary, a sprawling multi-million-dollar penthouse that I had secretly maintained ever since I sold my equity firm. I rode the private elevator up to the top floor and stepped into the expansive glass-walled apartment. The city lights sparkled below me like a sea of diamonds, a sharp contrast to the damp, miserable precinct I had visited earlier. I walked directly into my massive walk-in closet. I unbuttoned the faded flannel shirt I had worn for the past 5 years and tossed it carelessly onto the polished hardwood floor. I kicked off the scuffed, oil-stained work boots and stepped out of the frayed denim jeans. That humble, broken old man no longer existed. I reached into the cedar-lined wardrobe and pulled out a custom-tailored charcoal gray Tom Ford suit. The fabric was incredibly rich and heavy-cut, perfectly to command absolute authority. I slipped into a crisp, pure white dress shirt, fastened a dark silk tie around my collar, and slid my arms into the tailored jacket. I walked over to the velvet-lined accessory drawer and retrieved a rare platinum timepiece, clasping it securely around my wrist. I stared at my reflection in the full-length mirror. The man looking back at me was not a retired mechanic. He was the ruthless, untouchable billionaire who had dominated the financial sector for decades. I smoothed the lapels of my jacket, feeling the familiar heavy weight of absolute power settling comfortably back onto my shoulders. Before leaving the closet, I grabbed a tiny state-of-the-art digital recording device from a secure safe. I activated the microphone, verified the flashing green indicator light, and slipped the device into the inner breast pocket of my suit jacket. Every single word Gregory Pierce spoke tonight would be permanently archived for the federal prosecutors. I walked into the spacious living room and picked up my encrypted mobile phone. I dialed Jonathan Reed's private line. He answered on the first ring, his tone sharp and ready. "Jonathan." I said, my voice echoing with cold, undeniable authority. "It is time. I want you to initiate the hostile takeover protocol right now." "Understood," Sir Jonathan replied firmly. "I am transmitting the authorized legal injunctions to the Federal Banking Commission as we speak. I want you to sever all of Gregory's administrative credentials," I commanded, pacing across the marble floor. "I want you to freeze his corporate accounts, his personal checking accounts, and his offshore safety nets. By the time I walk into his private study, I want that arrogant criminal to be completely, utterly bankrupt. Lock the building down and alert the federal authorities that we are officially surrendering the embezzlement evidence to their division." "Consider it done, Mr. Cole," Jonathan assured me. "The trap is completely set. I will coordinate with the authorities and ensure his digital access is entirely terminated within the next 20 minutes. I disconnected the call and headed down to the private garage. I bypassed my rusty Ford and walked over to a sleek, armored black town car. I slid behind the luxurious leather steering wheel, the powerful engine roaring to life with a quiet, menacing purr. I drove out of the parking structure and navigated toward the exclusive, heavily wooded hills where the wealthiest families in the state resided. The sprawling Pierce estate was located at the very end of a winding private road. I passed the towering trees and pristine landscaping that masked the sheer corruption hiding within those expensive walls. I pulled up to the massive wrought iron gates that blocked the entrance to the property. 2 heavily armed private security guards stepped out of a brick guardhouse, shining a bright tactical flashlight against my windshield. I slowly rolled down the tinted window, staring blankly at the guard. He looked at the expensive vehicle, then at my tailored suit, momentarily confused by the stark contrast to the man he was likely told to expect. "I am here to see Gregory," I stated flatly, my voice carrying the unmistakable weight of pure power. "He is expecting me." The guard hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding and tapping a code into his radio. The heavy iron gates slowly groaned open, granting me access to the immaculate grounds. I drove up the long, sweeping driveway, the tires crunching softly against the pristine gravel. The massive mansion loomed ahead, its tall windows glowing warmly against the dark night sky. I parked the car right in front of the grand entrance. The sheer scale of the mansion, was intended to project absolute authority with towering stone pillars and massive oak doors. Before I could step out of my vehicle, a stern man dressed in a dark security suit approached my door. He pulled it open, his eyes scanning me with professional detachment. He ordered me to step out and immediately patted me down, thoroughly checking my waist and ankles for concealed weapons. He completely missed the state-of-the-art digital recording device tucked safely inside the inner breast pocket of my suit jacket. He did not say a single word to me. He simply gestured with a gloved hand, commanding me to follow him into the sprawling residence. The interior of the house was aggressively lavish. The floors were lined with imported marble that echoed softly under my footsteps. Everything inside this massive estate was meticulously designed to intimidate, to make a normal person feel incredibly small and powerless. But I was not a small man. I held infinitely more power in my single phone call than this entire estate could ever possess. We walked down a long corridor that smelled faintly of lemon polish and aged wood. We finally reached a set of towering double doors at the very end of the hallway. The security guard knocked twice, pushed the heavy doors open, and stepped aside to let me enter the room. The private study was a cavernous room reeking of aged leather, expensive cigar smoke, and unearned wealth. A massive crystal chandelier hung from the vaulted ceiling, casting a warm glow over the luxurious space. In the center of the room, sitting behind an oversized mahogany desk, was Gregory Pierce. He was leaning back in a plush leather chair, looking incredibly relaxed, with a crystal flute of expensive champagne resting effortlessly in his right hand. Valerie was sitting casually on the very edge of the desk, swinging her legs like a spoiled child who had just won a rigged game. She held her own glass of champagne, the delicate bubbles catching the bright light of the chandelier. They were celebrating. They were literally toasting to the absolute destruction of my innocent son and their impending escape to Geneva. They looked up as I walked into the room, their eyes instantly darting up and down my tailored Tom Ford suit. For a brief fraction of a second, I saw a flicker of genuine confusion cross Gregory's arrogant face. He had fully expected to see the broken weeping mechanic in a faded flannel shirt. He had expected a poor pensioner trembling with fear. He did not expect a man who looked like he could easily buy and sell the entire building. But Gregory's vast arrogance quickly overrode his momentary confusion. He assumed I had simply rented a nice suit to try and salvage whatever tiny shred of dignity I still had left. He set his champagne flute down onto a silver coaster and laced his fingers together, resting his elbows heavily on the polished wood of the desk. "Come in, Harrison," Gregory commanded smoothly, a sickeningly polite smile stretching across his face. "Have a seat. We have urgent business to discuss tonight." I walked slowly toward the rigid wooden chair positioned directly in front of his desk. I sat down carefully, intentionally, maintaining a posture of total defeat. I let my shoulders slump just enough to feed his massive ego, keeping my eyes fixed firmly on the ground. Valerie took a slow, deliberate sip of her champagne, looking down at me with eyes completely devoid of any empathy. She did not even bother to ask how her husband was doing. She simply smirked, waiting in eager silence for her father to deliver the final crushing blow. Gregory opened a dark leather folder resting on his desk and pulled out a thick stack of complex legal documents. He slid them slowly across the smooth mahogany surface until they rested right in front of me. I looked down at the papers. The title, printed in bold black ink, read, "Full Asset Restitution and Forfeiture Agreement." My blood boiled fiercely beneath my calm exterior, but I kept my facial expression entirely blank and terrified. "What is this, Gregory?" I asked softly, letting a perfect fake tremor bleed into my voice. "I thought we were going to discuss a plea deal to keep my son out of prison." "We are discussing exactly that," Harrison Gregory replied, his tone dripping with absolute condescension. "But freedom is never free in this world. The federal prosecutor requires substantial proof that Christopher is actively attempting to repay the $4 million he stole from my company. Since he is locked in a cheap motel, having a mental breakdown, that financial burden, unfortunately, falls entirely onto your shoulders. You want me to pay you $4 million? I stammered weakly, shaking my head. I am a retired old man. I do not have that kind of money. Gregory leaned forward, his dark eyes locking onto mine with intense greed. I know exactly what you have, Harrison Gregory stated coldly. My attorneys ran a background check on your financial history this afternoon. I know about the $300,000 sitting in your retirement pension fund. And I also know that Christopher holds the deed to that beautiful suburban house, a property that is completely paid off. You are going to sign over every single penny of your retirement account to my holding company tonight. And then you are going to sign this transfer, surrendering the deed of the house directly to Valerie as compensation for the trauma your son has caused her. Valerie smiled wickedly, swirling the champagne in her flute. It is the absolute least you can do, Dad, she chimed in. Christopher completely ruined our lives. He destroyed my future. Taking the house and your miserable pension is barely scratching the surface of what he actually owes us. I looked back and forth between them, genuinely marveling at the sheer evil radiating from their pores. You are asking me to give up everything I have left in this world, I whispered, playing the role of the broken victim perfectly. If I give you my pension, I will have absolutely nothing to live on. If I give you the house, my son will have nowhere to go when he gets out. How can you ask a father to do this? Gregory slammed his palm against the desk. Because you have absolutely no other choice, he snarled, his polite facade dissolving. The federal agents are raiding my firm on Monday morning. By tomorrow afternoon, I am handing them the complete digital footprint of your son's embezzlement. They will issue a federal warrant, and he will be dragged into a maximum security penitentiary, where he will rot for 20 years. This contract sitting in front of you is his only lifeline. I stared at the documents, my heart beating with a cold rhythm. Gregory reached into his suit pocket, pulled out a heavy gold fountain pen, and casually tossed it across the desk. It bounced off the legal papers and hit my chest, dropping directly into my lap. Sign it, old man, or your son dies behind bars. The heavy gold fountain pen bounced off the legal documents and landed directly in my lap. I looked down at the expensive instrument, feeling the cool metal against my palm as I slowly picked it up. Gregory and Valerie watched me with eager, predatory anticipation, completely convinced that they had just delivered the final fatal blow to a weak and defenseless old man. They expected me to uncap that pen, weep a few pathetic tears of surrender, and sign away every single thing I had spent my entire life building. I held the gold barrel between both of my thumbs and index fingers, feeling its solid weight. Then, with a sudden violent twist of my wrists, I snapped the expensive fountain pen completely in half. The sharp cracking sound echoed through the cavernous study like a gunshot. Ink splattered across the flawless mahogany desk and stained the pristine white paper of their extortion contract. Gregory flinched, his arrogant smirk instantly vanishing, replaced by a deep defensive scowl. Valerie gasped, instinctively pulling her legs up onto the edge of the desk, as if she had just been physically struck. "What in the world is wrong with you?" Gregory shouted, his voice rising in sudden anger. "You just destroyed your only chance to save Christopher from a federal indictment." I did not raise my voice. I simply reached into the sleek leather portfolio I had brought with me and slowly pulled out my digital tablet. I placed it flat on the desk, right on top of their ink-stained restitution agreement. "I am not here to save my son from a federal indictment." "Gregory," I said quietly, locking my eyes with his. "I am here to save him from his wife." I reached out and tapped the screen of the tablet, bringing up the high-definition surveillance footage I had captured just hours ago. I pressed the play button and turned the volume up to its absolute maximum limit. The crystal-clear video filled the quiet study, illuminating the dark room with the bright, sterile light of Christopher and Valerie's kitchen. The camera angle provided a perfect, undeniable view of the marble island. On the screen, Valerie appeared in her silk robe, humming that sickeningly cheerful tune as she prepared the evening tea. The audio was pristine, capturing every single sound with horrifying clarity. We watched in absolute silence as the digital version of Valerie reached into her pocket, pulled out the small, unlabeled glass vial, and carefully squeezed the synthetic neurotoxin directly into the steaming mug. I kept my eyes fixed entirely on the real Valerie sitting across from me. Her mouth slowly dropped open, her breathing stopping completely as she watched herself committing a profound felony on the glowing screen. Then the audio of the phone call began to play. Gregory's recorded voice echoed off the walls of his own luxurious study, crisp and undeniable. "Is the mechanic gone?" the recorded Gregory asked. "Yes, Dad," the digital Valerie replied. "He completely bought the motel lie." The video continued to play, broadcasting their entire twisted conspiracy. The discussion about double dosing Christopher to turn his brain to mush. The detailed plan to let the federal agents raid the logistics headquarters at dawn. The ultimate goal of seizing the suburban house and flying first class to Geneva with $4 million of embezzled funds. Every single piece of their highly orchestrated betrayal was laid bare, entirely stripped of its elegant disguise. I let the video run until the very last word was spoken, ensuring they heard every terrible thing they had planned. When the footage finally ended, the tablet screen faded to black, leaving the massive study drowning in an incredibly heavy, suffocating silence. For several long seconds, absolutely no one moved or spoke. The sheer, undeniable reality of this evidence had paralyzed them both. Valerie sat frozen on the edge of the desk, her manicured fingers trembling violently. The color had completely drained from her face, leaving her skin looking like dull, lifeless wax. Her eyes were wide with pure, unadulterated terror, darting frantically between the dark tablet screen and my stoic face. Her hand shook so severely that she could no longer maintain her grip on the crystal champagne flute. The delicate glass slipped from her fingers, plummeting toward the floor. It struck the imported marble tiles and shattered into hundreds of glittering pieces with a sharp, explosive crash. The expensive, bubbling liquid splashed across her designer shoes and pooled into the deep crevices of the stone, but she did not even flinch. She just stared at me, completely unable to process the catastrophic collapse of her perfect, untraceable plan. I turned my attention toward Gregory. The powerful, untouchable chief executive officer was gone. He was gripping the armrests of his plush leather chair so tightly that his knuckles were stark white. His jaw was clenched, the muscles in his neck visibly twitching as he struggled to comprehend the massive breach in his security. He looked at the shattered pen, the ink-stained contract and the digital tablet, his mind desperately searching for a way out of the corner I had just painted him into. He had built his entire strategy on the absolute certainty that I was a poor, ignorant, and easily manipulated old man. Seeing the irrefutable evidence of his own crimes played back to him inside his private sanctuary completely shattered his reality. "You thought I was just a desperate, helpless pensioner," I said, my voice cutting through the thick silence like a razor blade. "You thought you could feed my son, poison, steal his future, and use my grief to finance your escape. You heavily underestimated the lengths a father will go to when his family is threatened." Gregory stared at me, his chest rising and falling in rapid, uneven intervals. I watched the initial shock slowly recede from his eyes, swiftly replaced by a dark, cornered desperation. The sheer arrogance that had defined his entire existence began to return, acting as a final, pathetic defense mechanism against the overwhelming reality of his defeat. He took a deep, shuddering breath and forcefully straightened his posture, refusing to surrender his perceived superiority. He remembered where he was. He was sitting inside his fortress, surrounded by acres of private land and protected by a team of highly paid, heavily armed security guards. He let out a harsh, bitter laugh that sounded entirely devoid of any actual humor. "You are completely out of your depth," Harrison Gregory sneered, a malicious light returning to his dark eyes. "You honestly think a single hidden camera changes anything tonight? You walked into my private estate. You brought the only copy of your precious little video directly into my house. He slowly reached across the mahogany desk, his hand hovering directly over a heavy brass intercom system, designed to summon his private security detail. I am going to have my men confiscate that tablet and smash it. Gregory threatened, his voice dropping into a low, deadly growl. Then I am going to have them physically throw you off my property. You are just an old mechanic. I will completely and utterly bury you. One broken half of the gold fountain pen rolled across the polished mahogany wood and came to a stop just inches from my hand. I looked down at the ruined instrument, the polished metal gleaming under the light of the crystal chandelier. Gregory Pierce leaned back in his luxurious leather chair, crossing his arms over his chest, with an expression of absolute, unshakable triumph. Beside him, Valerie let out a soft, mocking sigh, clearly annoyed that I was taking too long to surrender everything I owned. They were both waiting for me to break. They expected my hands to tremble, my eyes to fill with tears of total defeat, and my spirit to shatter completely under the crushing weight of their extortion. In their greedy, arrogant minds, the game was already over, and they had won the ultimate prize. I did not move for several long seconds. I let the silence stretch across the massive study, allowing the tension to build until the air in the room felt heavy and suffocating. My complete lack of reaction seemed to bother Gregory. His smug smile faltered for just a fraction of a second. He uncrossed his arms and leaned forward, placing his hands flat on the desk. Are you deaf? Harrison. Gregory snapped, his voice losing its polished aristocratic edge and dipping into something raw and ugly. I said, pick up the pen and sign the documents. Every minute you waste here is another minute your son spends rotting in that holding cell. I slowly raised my head. I did not look at the pen, and I did not look at the fraudulent restitution agreement they had so carefully prepared. I looked directly into Gregory's dark, impatient eyes. The mask of the terrified, broken mechanic that I had worn since the police station simply vanished. I let my shoulders straighten, throwing off the false posture of an old, defeated pensioner. I sat perfectly still, radiating a cold, calculated authority that instantly transformed the entire atmosphere of the room. Valerie shifted uncomfortably on the edge of the desk, sensing the sudden, drastic shift in my demeanor. I am not going to sign your papers, Gregory, I said quietly. My voice was completely steady, carrying a smooth, undeniable power that made him blink in genuine confusion. I am not going to give you my retirement pension, and I am certainly not going to surrender the deed to the home I purchased for my son. Gregory scoffed a harsh, dismissive sound. Then Christopher goes to federal prison, he stated flatly. It is really that simple. You have no leverage here, old man. You are completely out of options. I reached into my leather portfolio again. Gregory tensed slightly, perhaps thinking I was reaching for a weapon, but he relaxed when he saw my hand emerge holding a thick, heavy leather-bound dossier. The folder was secured with a silver clasp and stamped with the official insignia of a premier international financial institution. I held it for a moment, feeling the undeniable weight of the truth contained within its pages. With a swift, deliberate motion, I tossed the heavy dossier across the desk. It landed with a loud, resounding thud, sliding perfectly over their fraudulent extortion contract and knocking the gold fountain pen onto the marble floor. Read the first page, Gregory, I commanded softly. The tone of my voice was no longer that of a grieving father begging for mercy. It was the tone of a ruthless corporate executioner delivering a final verdict. Gregory stared at the leather dossier, a deep frown carving lines into his forehead. What is this garbage? He demanded, refusing to touch the folder. I do not have time for your pathetic attempts to delay the inevitable. If you do not sign my contract right now, I am calling the authorities. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the edge of his mahogany desk. I said, read the first page, Gregory. I repeated, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. Read it, or you will spend the rest of your miserable life wondering exactly how you lost everything. Valerie let out a nervous, high-pitched laugh. "Just open it, Dad," she urged, her voice trembling slightly. "Just look at whatever stupid thing he brought so we can finish this and get him out of our house." Gregory let out a frustrated breath. He reached out with his manicured hands and flipped open the silver clasp. He threw back the heavy leather cover, his eyes dropping to the first page of the densely printed document. I watched his face closely, observing the exact moment his entire reality fractured into a million unrecoverable pieces. The document resting on top of the stack was not a plea deal, and it was certainly not a bank statement from a humble mechanic. It was the ultimate shareholder registry and debt ownership declaration for Vanguard Apex. Gregory knew that name intimately. Vanguard Apex was the massive, shadowy holding company that had quietly purchased 80% of Pierce Logistics' debt and equity over the past 8 months. They were the lifeline that had kept his failing business afloat. The silent giant that literally owned the walls of the corporate headquarters he walked into every single morning. He had spent the last half-year desperately trying to uncover the identity of the primary shareholder, hoping to negotiate a restructuring of his massive debt. As his eyes scanned the complex legal jargon, his face grew pale. He read the clauses detailing the absolute controlling interest, the hostile takeover provisions, and the immediate liquidation rights. Then his gaze traveled slowly down to the very bottom of the page, searching for the authorized signature that held the fate of his entire empire. He stopped breathing. The silence in the luxurious study became absolutely deafening. The color drained completely from his face, leaving his skin looking like dull gray ash. His hands began to shake violently, the heavy parchment paper trembling between his fingers. He read the name printed clearly beneath the primary controlling signature, and then he read it again, completely unable to process the impossible truth staring back at him. Valerie noticed his sudden, catastrophic physical reaction. She slipped off the edge of the desk, her high heels clicking softly against the marble floor. "Dad?" she asked, her voice laced with rising panic. "Dad, what is it? What does that paper say?" Gregory did not answer her. He could not form the words. He slowly lifted his head, his wide, terrified eyes locking directly onto mine. He looked at my calm, unyielding expression, and then his eyes darted down to the immaculate cut of my tailored suit. The illusion of the poor, helpless old man dissolved entirely, replaced by the terrifying presence of the hidden billionaire who secretly orchestrated his financial reality. Gregory stumbled backward, his legs giving out completely as he collapsed heavily into his plush leather chair. He clutched the desk, gasping for breath. He finally realized that the vulnerable father he had confidently tried to extort was actually the undisputed master of his entire corporate universe. The executioner holding absolute power was sitting right there. Gregory Pierce continued to stare at me with a vacant, hollow expression, his chest rising and falling in rapid, uneven jerks. He looked like a man who had just watched his entire universe collapse into a pile of worthless dust. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound emerged from his throat. The profound, suffocating reality of his situation had entirely paralyzed his vocal cords. Valerie, still standing near the edge of the shattered champagne glass, finally lost her patience. She stomped her designer heel against the marble floor, her voice rising to a frantic, shrill pitch as she demanded to know exactly what was written on the document. She reached across the polished mahogany desk and snatched the heavy leather dossier right out of her father's trembling hands. I sat perfectly still in my tailored suit, watching her eyes dart rapidly across the thick parchment paper. It took her a few moments to comprehend the complex financial terminology, but when she reached the final signature line, the sheer magnitude of the revelation hit her with the force of a freight train. She gasped loudly, dropping the dossier onto the desk, as if the leather binding had suddenly caught fire. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of absolute horror and profound confusion. "You own Vanguard Apex," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sudden frantic beating of her own heart. "You own the holding company that controls our logistics firm." This is impossible. You are just a mechanic. I am the man who allowed you to believe I was just a mechanic. I corrected her, my voice echoing with a cold, unrelenting authority. I am the man who built an international financial empire from the ground up, and I am the father of the innocent man you spent the last 6 months systematically poisoning in his own home. I reached into the breast pocket of my suit jacket and pulled out my encrypted mobile phone. I placed it flat on the desk right next to the shattered gold fountain pen and tapped the screen to unlock it. I dialed Jonathan Reed's private secure line and pressed the speakerphone icon so his voice would broadcast clearly across the luxurious study. Jonathan answered on the very first ring, his tone sharp, professional, and completely ready for my final command. "I am here, Mr. Cole." Jonathan announced smoothly, the sound of his voice making Gregory flinch violently in his plush leather chair. "The Federal Banking Commission is standing by. The corporate security teams are awaiting your final authorization." I looked directly into Gregory's terrified eyes, allowing a dark, ruthless smile to finally surface on my face. "Execute," I said simply. "Understood," Sir Jonathan replied. "Commencing full asset liquidation and hostile lockout protocols right now." Less than 5 seconds after Jonathan disconnected the call, the profound silence in the study was abruptly shattered. Gregory's sleek mobile phone resting near a crystal decanter on the edge of the desk began to vibrate wildly. The screen illuminated the dim space, flashing a rapid, endless stream of high-priority notification banners. A split second later, Valerie's phone began to chime frantically from inside her designer purse. She scrambled to pull it out, her hands shaking so severely she nearly dropped the expensive device onto the marble floor. She stared at her glowing screen, her eyes widening in pure, unadulterated panic. "My accounts are locked," she shrieked frantically, tapping her manicured fingers against the digital display. "Every single one of my platinum credit cards is showing a zero balance. The banking application says my assets are frozen pending a federal injunction. Dad, what is happening? Fix this right now." Gregory ignored her screaming. He snatched his own phone from the desk and stared at the incoming messages with a look of absolute despair. His chief financial officer was sending him frantic, panicked texts in all capital letters. The corporate servers at Pierce Logistics had just been entirely shut down by an external administrative override. The physical building was currently being locked down by a private security firm acting on behalf of the majority shareholder. Every single employee was being escorted off the premises, and Gregory's personal executive credentials had been permanently revoked. He was no longer the chief executive officer of his own company. He was a trespasser in an empire that now belonged entirely to me. But the digital apocalypse did not stop there. Gregory opened a secure encrypted messaging application he used to communicate with his offshore wealth managers in Switzerland. A new message had just arrived, carrying news that completely shattered his final desperate hope for escape. "The Geneva accounts." Gregory whispered, his voice cracking with a profound, soul-crushing agony. "The offshore shell accounts. They are completely frozen. The federal authorities have issued an international freeze order on the $4 million. We cannot move a single dime." Valerie let out a piercing, hysterical scream that echoed painfully off the vaulted ceiling of the study. She threw her useless mobile phone across the room, the device shattering into pieces against a heavy wooden bookshelf. "You promised me we were safe," she roared, turning her blazing, furious eyes toward her father. "You promised me the money was completely untraceable. You told me the federal agents would never be able to touch the Swiss accounts before we got on that flight tomorrow morning." Gregory stood up, his face flushed with a desperate defensive rage. "Shut your mouth, Valerie," he commanded harshly, glancing nervously in my direction. "Do not say another word in front of him. You are going to incriminate us even further." "I am already incriminated," Valerie screamed, stepping forward and jabbing an accusing finger directly at his chest. Her carefully constructed facade of elegant superiority completely dissolved, revealing the selfish, treacherous predator hiding underneath. I spent 6 months meticulously measuring toxic chemicals into my own husband's tea because you forced me to do it. You are the one who lost millions of dollars making stupid, reckless bets on international shipping futures. You are the one who borrowed money from violent underground syndicates. You dragged me into this massive embezzlement scheme because you were too much of a coward to face the consequences of your own catastrophic financial failures. I sat quietly in my chair, watching the absolute destruction of their relationship unfold right in front of my eyes. The moment their stolen wealth was stripped away, their fierce family loyalty instantly evaporated. They were turning on each other like starving wolves locked inside a cage, perfectly willing to tear each other to shreds just to save their own skin. Gregory grabbed Valerie by the arm, shaking her violently as he tried to silence her frantic, damning confessions. He told her she was a foolish, ungrateful child, reminding her that she had happily spent the stolen money to finance her lavish lifestyle and purchase expensive diamond watches. She screamed back, calling him a pathetic, ruined old man who had completely destroyed her entire future. They were entirely consumed by their own bitter hatred, utterly oblivious to the storm gathering outside their walls. I slowly stood up from the wooden chair, buttoning the front of my tailored suit jacket, with a calm, deliberate motion. I reached into my breast pocket, retrieved the tiny digital recording device, and placed it prominently on the mahogany desk right beside my shattered fountain pen. The green indicator light blinked steadily, confirming that every single word of Valerie's frantic, hysterical confession had been perfectly captured. Gregory stopped shaking his daughter, his eyes locking onto the recording device with a look of pure, unadulterated terror. He finally realized that his own daughter had just verbally handed the federal prosecutors the final piece of evidence they needed to secure a conviction. "You wanted to completely ruin my son," I said, my voice echoing with a cold, unforgiving finality that silenced their bitter arguing instantly. "You decided to treat his innocent life as nothing more than a convenient disposable shield to protect your own miserable greed. You thought you were preying on a weak, helpless family. But you chose the wrong victim. You chose to hunt in a forest where you were never the apex predator. Now you are going to pay the ultimate price for that arrogance." Gregory opened his mouth to beg, his previous pride completely replaced by a pathetic, desperate fear, but his words were suddenly drowned out by a loud, piercing sound coming from outside the mansion. I turned my head slowly toward the massive floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the sweeping gravel driveway. Through the thick glass, brilliant flashes of red and blue lights began to rapidly illuminate the dark estate, painting the interior walls of the luxurious study with an urgent, terrifying glow. The distinct, high-pitched wail of approaching police sirens tore through the quiet suburban night, growing louder and more intense with every passing second. The authorities had finally arrived. The piercing wail of the police sirens tore through the quiet, exclusive neighborhood, growing deafeningly loud as multiple vehicles swarmed the sweeping gravel driveway of the Pierce estate. The brilliant flashes of red and blue lights sliced through the darkness, casting erratic, terrifying shadows across the lavish interior of the mahogany study. Gregory stood frozen behind his massive desk, his face drained of all color, his arrogant posture completely crumbling under the sheer, undeniable reality of his impending destruction. I remained perfectly still in my tailored suit, watching the absolute panic finally take root in his dark eyes. The sound of heavy tactical boots pounding against the imported marble floors of the grand hallway echoed throughout the mansion. The private security guards Gregory had hired to intimidate me had completely stepped aside immediately, surrendering their weapons the moment they saw the federal jackets of the approaching agents. There was no loyalty in a falling empire. Valerie pressed her back against the towering wooden bookshelves, her hands covering her mouth, as she let out a series of short, frantic gasps. She looked wildly toward the heavy double doors, her designer silk robe trembling violently against her fragile frame. The luxurious sanctuary they had built using stolen funds and ruthless deception was rapidly closing in on them. Gregory frantically reached for the shattered pieces of his gold fountain pen, as if the small, broken instrument could somehow rewrite the catastrophic ending to his meticulously orchestrated scheme. He looked frantically toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, searching for an impossible escape route into the dark, heavily wooded hills behind his sprawling property. But there was nowhere left to run. The fortress he had designed to keep the world out had instantly become the very cage that would lock him inside. The towering double doors of the private study were suddenly thrown open with a violent explosive force that made the crystal chandelier rattle above our heads. A team of heavily armed federal agents poured into the room, their tactical flashlights cutting through the thick cigar smoke and illuminating the terrified faces of my enemies. Local police officers fanned out along the perimeter, securing the exits and immediately taking absolute control of the environment. A senior federal investigator stepped forward, his badge gleaming under the bright lights, his expression forged in pure, uncompromising authority. Gregory Pierce, the investigator, announced, his voice booming across the cavernous space. "You are under arrest for massive corporate embezzlement, federal wire fraud, and severe financial tampering. Valerie Pierce, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit federal fraud and the systematic, premeditated, attempted murder of your husband." Valerie let out a piercing shriek, dropping to her knees on the expensive Persian rug. Gregory stared at the federal agent, his chest heaving with desperate, ragged breaths. "How did you get a warrant so fast?" Gregory stammered, his voice cracking with pure disbelief. "You cannot do this. You have no legal jurisdiction here without a judge signing a formal indictment." I slowly reached out and picked up the digital recording device from the desk, slipping it smoothly back into my breast pocket. "They did not need to wait for a judge tonight, Gregory," I stated, my voice slicing through the chaotic noise of the room. "Right before I stepped foot onto your property, I forwarded the verified toxicology reports, the high-definition surveillance video, and the complete offshore banking ledgers directly to the district attorney. The federal prosecutor had a signed warrant in his hands before you even poured that glass of champagne." The devastating realization of my preemptive strike completely shattered the last remaining fragments of Gregory's arrogant facade. He looked at the federal agents, then at the undeniable proof of his ruined empire scattered across his desk, and his deeply ingrained survival instincts took over. In a final, incredibly foolish act of absolute desperation, Gregory lunged toward the heavy glass doors leading out to the private terrace. He did not even make it 3 steps. 2 federal agents moved with terrifying practiced speed. They intercepted his path, grabbing his tailored suit jacket and twisting his arms violently behind his back. Gregory shouted in pain as they drove him forcefully forward, slamming his face down onto the very same mahogany desk where he had confidently tried to extort my entire life savings just minutes ago. The brutal impact rattled the heavy wood, scattering the fraudulent restitution agreement and the broken fountain pen onto the cold marble floor. The sharp, unmistakable sound of heavy steel handcuffs clicking tightly around his wrists echoed through the room, finalizing his complete and utter downfall. The untouchable chief executive officer was now nothing more than a restrained, humiliated criminal bleeding onto his own desk. He turned his head sideways against the polished wood, his dark eyes locking onto mine with a look of pure, burning hatred mixed with profound, inescapable defeat. "You set me up." Gregory spat, his voice muffled against the surface of the desk. "You destroyed everything I built." I looked down at him with absolute, unwavering coldness. "You destroyed yourself," Gregory the First replied smoothly. "I simply provided the authorities with the exact shovel you used to dig your own grave." The federal agents hauled him roughly to his feet, securing his arms as they prepared to march him out. As the officers dragged Gregory toward the shattered double doors, Valerie completely broke down. She scrambled across the marble floor on her hands and knees, ignoring the sharp, glittering pieces of the broken champagne flute that dug into her skin. She reached out and desperately grabbed the perfectly tailored fabric of my trousers, her tears soaking into the dark material. "Dad." She wept, her voice entirely stripped of its former venom, replaced by a pathetic, agonizing wail. "Dad, please do not let them take me away. I am your daughter-in-law. I am Christopher's wife. We are family. You have to tell them to stop." I did not move. I stood perfectly still, looking down at the woman who had smiled in my face while meticulously measuring toxic chemicals into my innocent son's evening tea. She stared up at me with wide, pleading eyes, desperately hoping to find a single shred of the gentle, forgiving old mechanic she thought she had successfully manipulated. But that man was gone. I slowly reached down and firmly pried her trembling fingers off my clothing, pushing her hands away with a slow, deliberate motion that carried absolutely no warmth. I looked down at her coldly, my voice dropping into a low, unforgiving register that silenced her frantic sobbing. "You systematically poisoned my blood," I stated flatly. "You are absolutely nothing to me." Two female officers stepped forward, pulling Valerie up from the floor and securely fastening iron cuffs around her wrists. She screamed hysterically as they dragged her out of the luxurious study, her cries echoing down the long marble corridor. I slowly walked down the grand front steps, carefully stepping into the cool night air. I followed them out, watching calmly, as Gregory and Valerie were forcefully shoved into the back of separate police cruisers, right in front of their deeply shocked, wealthy neighbors. I stood in the cool night air for a long time, after the flashing sirens disappeared down the winding road. The sprawling Pierce estate, once a towering fortress of arrogance and corruption, now felt completely hollow and utterly defeated. I turned my back on the massive mansion, walked over to my armored town car, and drove away from the wreckage of their lives. I did not return to my luxury penthouse or my quiet suburban home. I drove straight back to the private medical clinic where my son was fighting the hardest battle of his entire life. The next 5 days were an agonizing blur of sterile white walls, hushed medical consultations, and the rhythmic beeping of intensive care monitors. Christopher went through a brutal, heavily monitored detoxification process. The synthetic neurotoxin Valerie had so ruthlessly fed him was deeply embedded in his system, and pulling it out required intense medical intervention. I sat by his bedside day and night, refusing to leave his side for more than a few minutes. I watched his body tremble and sweat as the chemical fog slowly lifted from his brain. I held his hand through the worst of the withdrawal, silently promising him that the nightmare was finally over. While I kept my quiet vigil in the hospital room, the outside world was completely turned upside down. The federal raid on Pierce Logistics headquarters had triggered a massive media firestorm. Every major news network in the country was broadcasting the spectacular downfall of Gregory Pierce and the shocking arrest of his daughter. Financial reporters detailed the staggering scope of their offshore embezzlement scheme, completely vindicating my son in the court of public opinion. Jonathan Reed visited me at the clinic every evening, delivering meticulous updates in hushed tones, while Christopher slept. The evidence I had provided to the district attorney was absolutely ironclad. The offshore accounts in Geneva were permanently seized by international authorities, and the fabricated digital trail they had planted on Christopher's terminal was exposed as a desperate, clumsy fraud. But the criminal charges were only half of my retaliation. With Vanguard, Apex officially stepping out of the shadows, I authorized Jonathan to completely wipe out the remaining executive hierarchy at Pierce Logistics. I did not just stop at Gregory. I ordered my legal team to ruthlessly purge the entire board of directors. Every single executive who had turned a blind eye to Gregory's illegal margin calls and toxic offshore loans was immediately terminated, stripped of their lavish severance packages, and securely locked out of the corporate network. We brought in a massive team of forensic accountants to scrub the company entirely clean. The corrupt, decaying empire Gregory had built was completely dismantled and effectively erased from the financial map, paving the way for a total corporate rebirth under my direct control. On the morning of the 6th day, the heavy curtains in the intensive care suite were finally pulled back, allowing the bright morning sunlight to flood the sterile room. I was sitting in the leather chair beside the bed, holding a warm cup of black coffee, when I noticed a profound shift in my son. Christopher slowly opened his eyes. For the first time in over half a year, his gaze was completely clear, sharp, and focused. The dull, vacant stare induced by the neurotoxin had entirely vanished. He looked around the pristine hospital room, deep confusion, knitting his brows before his eyes finally landed on me. "Dad." He whispered, his voice raspy and incredibly weak, but undeniably his own. "Where am I right now? What happened to me?" I set my coffee cup down on the table and leaned forward gently, taking his hand in mine. I took a deep breath, preparing to completely dismantle the quiet illusion I had meticulously maintained for 5 long years. I told him absolutely everything. I spoke in a calm, steady voice, explaining exactly how Valerie had systematically poisoned his meals to destroy his cognitive functions over the past 6 months. I watched the absolute horror wash over his pale face as I detailed the federal raid, the fabricated embezzlement charges, and the vicious, calculated plan Gregory had orchestrated to throw him into a maximum security federal prison. I did not spare him the painful details, knowing that hearing the unfiltered truth was the only way he could truly begin to heal from such a massive betrayal. When I finished recounting the terrifying events of the precinct and the profound betrayal of his wife, Christopher was openly weeping. He pulled his hand from mine and covered his face, his shoulders shaking heavily with the profound, devastating grief of a man who suddenly realized his entire marriage was a monstrous, orchestrated lie designed to destroy him. But I was not finished speaking. "There is one more thing you need to know, Christopher," I said softly, waiting for him to lower his hands and look at me. I looked directly into his tear-filled, bloodshot eyes. "When you were arrested, Gregory told me he needed $4 million to save you. He thought I was just a retired, helpless mechanic living on a meager pension. He had absolutely no idea that 5 years ago I sold my private equity firm for $850 million. Christopher simply stared at me, completely unable to process this final massive revelation. He blinked rapidly, shaking his head slowly, as if trying to clear away a lingering hallucination from the toxin. "You are a billionaire." He choked out, his voice laced with absolute, unadulterated disbelief. "But you drive a rusted truck every day. You live in a tiny suburban house. Why did you hide this massive secret from me, Dad?" I reached out and gently rested my rough hand against his tear-stained cheek. "Because I deeply wanted you to build your own life." I explained, my voice thick with raw emotion. "I wanted you to know the profound value of your own hard work without the crushing weight of my financial shadow hanging over you. I wanted you to be your own man, Christopher. But when they tried to destroy you, when they tried to take away your freedom and your future, I used every single resource I had to completely annihilate them. I bought Gregory's company, I froze his offshore accounts, and I personally handed the federal agents the exact evidence to lock them away for the rest of their natural lives." Christopher let out a broken, shuddering sob. The sheer magnitude of my love and the extreme lengths I had gone to protect him finally settled into his recovering mind. He pushed himself up from the hospital pillows, completely ignoring the tangle of medical wires, and threw his arms tightly around my neck. I buried my face in his shoulder, holding my strong, innocent son as he cried. We stayed exactly like that for a very long time, the profound silence of the medical room wrapping securely around us like a warm, protective shield. The absolute worst of the storm had finally passed, and we were the only ones left standing. One entire month drifted by, bringing with it a profound and deeply necessary healing process for both of us. Christopher moved into my downtown penthouse while his physical strength and mental clarity slowly returned. I hired the best private chefs and medical therapists to ensure his body completely purged the last lingering traces of the synthetic neurotoxin. We spent our evenings sitting together on the expansive balcony, looking out over the glittering city skyline as the cool winds blew past us. We talked for hours about everything we had missed over the past 5 years. I told him about the massive complexities of managing Vanguard Apex, and he shared his own ambitious dreams for the future of the logistics industry. The toxic shadows of Gregory and Valerie were entirely banished from our daily lives, securely locked away behind the heavy steel doors of a federal penitentiary awaiting their formal sentencing. Their sprawling estate had already been seized and put up for public auction by the federal authorities to compensate the numerous victims of Gregory and his offshore margin fraud. The suburban house that Valerie had so desperately tried to steal was legally returned to Christopher, though he immediately decided to put it on the open real estate market. He told me he never wanted to step foot inside those tainted walls ever again, and I completely understood his firm decision to simply walk away from that dark chapter. He was absolutely ready for a completely fresh start, and I was determined to give him the greatest platform possible to launch his new life. That fresh start officially began on a crisp, bright Monday morning. I drove Christopher direct to the financial district in my armored town car. He was wearing a sharply tailored navy blue suit that perfectly complemented his fully restored health and his renewed sense of absolute purpose. The healthy color had fully returned to his cheeks, and the intelligent, driven spark that always defined him was shining brightly in his deep green eyes once more. We pulled up to the towering glass and steel skyscraper that had formerly served as the primary headquarters for the notoriously corrupt Pierce Logistics. But the massive silver letters mounted above the grand entrance had been completely removed and meticulously replaced over the long weekend. The gleaming new sign proudly read Harrison Logistics, reflecting the morning sun with a brilliant, undeniable permanence. I parked the vehicle securely near the front steps, and we walked together through the heavy revolving glass doors. The main lobby of the corporate building was absolutely packed to the brim with people. Hundreds of dedicated employees had gathered across the sprawling marble floor, their faces glowing with genuine excitement and profound collective relief. These were the honest, hard-working men and women who had spent the last year living in constant, terrifying fear of losing their livelihoods under Gregory and his disastrous financial mismanagement. They were the innocent people who would have been completely destroyed and left entirely jobless if the corrupt company had been allowed to go bankrupt. When Christopher and I stepped into the center of the massive room, a huge wave of thunderous applause erupted spontaneously from the diverse crowd. The cheering echoed beautifully off the high vaulted ceilings, washing over us in a warm, undeniable tide of pure appreciation. It was not the forced, mandatory applause of terrified subordinates greeting a ruthless tyrant. It was a pure, unadulterated expression of deep gratitude and intense loyalty. I had personally ensured that every single lower-level employee retained their job during the hostile corporate takeover, and I had immediately authorized a company-wide bonus to compensate them for the severe financial stress Gregory had wrongfully put them through. Christopher walked confidently through the parted crowd, shaking hands and exchanging warm, genuine smiles with the various workers he had personally collaborated with for so many years. He knew their names, he knew their individual struggles, and he deeply respected their immense dedication to keeping the logistical operations running smoothly during the absolute darkest times. He stepped up onto the small elevated landing, located near the main marble reception desk, and slowly turned around to face the massive quieted assembly. He raised his hands to quiet the cheering room, bringing a sudden respectful hush over the massive crowd of gathered professionals. His voice rang out clear and incredibly strong, entirely free of the devastating chemical fog that had once imprisoned his brilliant mind. He spoke eloquently and passionately about the absolute importance of maintaining strict corporate integrity at every single level of the business. He talked about properly valuing the loyal people who actually did the heavy lifting, and about building a profitable future based on complete transparency rather than ruthless, selfish greed. He firmly promised them that Harrison Logistics would never operate in the dark, dangerous shadows of illegal debt or offshore manipulation. He assured them that every single person standing in that building was considered a vital, highly respected part of his new corporate family, and that their daily efforts would always be recognized and directly rewarded. The employees roared with massive approval, their tired faces suddenly shining with a fierce, renewed hope for a stable and prosperous future. My son was not just taking over a broken company. He was completely redefining its entire soul from the ground up, washing away the lingering toxicity left behind by a deeply corrupt administration. He was confidently stepping into his rightful place as an intelligent, profoundly compassionate leader. He was effectively merging the strong moral compass I had carefully taught him during his youth with the vast, untouchable financial resources I had secretly provided for his ultimate success. I stood quietly at the very back of the crowded lobby, leaning casually against a polished marble pillar while the celebration continued. I kept my hands tucked warmly inside the pockets of my tailored suit jacket, a quiet, deeply satisfied smile resting comfortably on my face. I watched my son command the massive room with a natural, entirely effortless grace that filled my aging heart with absolute pride. He did not need me holding his hand or managing his battles anymore. He was a capable, resilient man who had survived the absolute worst betrayal imaginable and emerged incredibly stronger on the other side. The hidden billionaire who had lurked silently in the shadows to protect him could finally fade away into a quiet, peaceful retirement. I took one last long look at Christopher as he happily shook hands with his new chief of operations, surrounded by a team of people who truly believed in his inspiring vision. I turned around, slowly, pushed open the heavy glass doors, and walked proudly out into the bright, warm morning sunlight. The bustling city streets moved around me in a chaotic, beautiful rhythm, entirely ignorant of the massive corporate war that had just concluded. I took a deep breath of fresh, clean air, feeling an immense, profound weight permanently lift from my tired shoulders. My secret empire had served its ultimate purpose. It completely protected my family. 4 months later, the heavy oak doors of the federal courthouse swung shut, finalizing the absolute destruction of the Pierce family. I sat in the front row of the polished gallery, watching silently as the presiding judge delivered the ultimate verdict. Gregory and Valerie stood side by side before the bench, stripped of their tailored suits and expensive jewelry. They wore standard-issue orange uniforms, their wrists securely bound by heavy steel chains. The mountain of irrefutable evidence I had meticulously provided left their high-priced defense attorneys completely powerless. The high-definition surveillance video, the complex toxicology reports, and the offshore banking ledgers painted a horrifying picture of calculated betrayal. The judge did not show them a single ounce of mercy. He looked down from his elevated seat and sentenced both Gregory and Valerie to 25 years in a maximum security penitentiary without the possibility of parole. Their convictions included attempted murder, severe financial tampering, and massive federal wire fraud. Valerie immediately collapsed against the wooden defense table, sobbing uncontrollably as the heavy reality of spending the best years of her life inside a concrete cell finally crushed her. Gregory simply stared blankly at the floor, a broken, empty shell of the arrogant executive he once was. Christopher sat right beside me, his posture straight and his mind entirely clear. He did not smile as his former wife was forcefully led away by the armed bailiffs. There was no joy in his eyes, only a profound, quiet sense of closure. The toxic anchor that had been dragging him down into the dark abyss had finally been cut loose. We walked out of the courthouse together, stepping into the bright, warm afternoon sunlight. A massive swarm of aggressive reporters and flashing cameras waited near the stone steps, desperate for a statement from the secretive billionaire who had single-handedly dismantled a corrupt corporate empire. I gently placed a hand on my son's shoulder, giving him a proud, reassuring nod. He stepped forward to address the hungry press as the newly appointed Chief Executive Officer of Harrison Logistics, projecting total confidence and unshakable integrity. I did not stay to bask in the blinding spotlight. I quietly slipped away through a side exit, completely avoiding the frantic media circus. I walked past the sleek armored town car waiting in the VIP parking zone and opted instead to slide behind the steering wheel of my old rusted Ford truck. The faded leather seats squeaked softly as I settled in, and the engine roared to life with a comforting, familiar rumble. I drove away from the towering skyscrapers and the chaotic noise of the financial district, heading steadily toward the peaceful, tree-lined streets of the quiet suburbs. The cool breeze drifted through my open window, carrying the sweet scent of blooming pine trees. As I navigated the winding roads, I reflected on the violent storm we had just conquered. I had possessed the power to utterly ruin my enemies, long before they ever made their first move against my family. But true power does not need to be loud, flashy, or constantly put on display. True power is the quiet, disciplined ability to strike with absolute, devastating precision exactly when the moment requires it. I took a deep, grounding breath, resting my rough hands on the worn steering wheel. Every single rusted edge reminded me of the humble foundation I built my life upon. The skyline in my rearview mirror belonged to a dark world of ruthless predators I conquered, but never loved. My wealth was merely a necessary weapon forged to shield the people I cared about. As the evening shadows lengthened across the quiet neighborhood, I felt the tension completely leave my body. I pulled into the driveway of my modest home, shifted the heavy truck into park, and turned off the engine. The world was finally completely safe again. The harsh truth is family is supposed to be your sanctuary, but sometimes the most venomous snakes hide at your own dinner table. I spent my life building a quiet legacy only to have greedy predators mistake my silence for weakness. A father's love isn't just about providing financially. It's about having the ruthlessness to protect your blood when wolves circle. Never let anyone belittle your quiet life, and never ignore your gut feeling. Money can buy expensive watches and fake smiles, but it can never buy the intellect and the sheer willpower of a man fighting for his son. If this story of justice made your blood pump, hit that subscribe button and smash the like icon. Have you ever had to expose a toxic family member? Tell me your story in the comments right below. Stay strong, trust your instincts, and I'll see you in the next video.